Greetings, everyone. I'm Charlie Sharpless, the Assistant Director for Research at the Erlanger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. I'm pleased to welcome you to our summer seminar series, New Light, Rising Stars in Energy and the Environment. Here we feature weekly talks by early career researchers working with faculty at the Erlanger Center, where our mission is to develop practical solutions for a sustainable energy future. Reflecting the inherently transdisciplinary nature of this mission, this series spotlights the next generation of leaders from a diverse array of fields across engineering, energy systems analysis, materials science, the social sciences, public policy, and more. We're excited to host these outstanding scholars and bring their work to you through the seminar series. Before continuing, I'd like to note that if you have questions at any point during the talk, please type them into the Q&A box. At the end, we'll also have the raise hand feature enabled, and we'll address as many questions as we can in the time available, starting with questions received through the Q&A box during the talk. Today, our speaker is Dr. Erin Mayfield. Dr. Mayfield holds a bachelor's in environmental science from Rutgers University, a master's in environmental engineering from the Johns Hopkins University, and a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. This fall, she will be joining the faculty at Dartmouth College as an assistant professor. But in the meantime, we are pleased to still have Dr. Mayfield at Princeton as an associate research scholar, working with Drs. Jesse Jenkins and Eric Larson in the Energy Systems Analysis Group. Work in that group is broadly aimed at identifying technologies and associated approaches to facilitate solutions for long-term energy-related societal problems. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Larson, who will introduce today's talk.
Thanks, Charlie. A pleasure to introduce Erin. She's a sustainable systems engineering and public policy researcher. She develops and applies multi-objective computational models that integrate techno-economic, environmental, and social equity objectives to inform energy and industrial infrastructure decarbonization transitions. She's had an interesting journey prior to landing at Princeton 2 years ago. You can see the details on the event announcement page, but some of her past work with other organizations has involved assessments of natural resource damages in connection with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, hazardous waste remediation, and ecosystem services valuation related to petrochemical and pesticide contamination. It gives you some sense of the breadths of her interests, and the modeling that she does is very rigorous and deep. For the past 2 years, Erin has been part of the Net Zero America project research team, and it's not an understatement to say that her contributions to this project have been key to the important impacts the project is having. It's been wonderful to have her on the team. We're delighted that she will be continuing her path-blazing research at Dartmouth, and we are looking forward to continuing our collaborations with her long distance. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Erin for her talk, Designing Net Zero Emissions Energy Systems to Address Environmental and Societal Objectives. Take it away, Erin.
Thanks for the introduction, Eric. So I'm happy to be here. My presentation today is about incorporating non-cost objectives into energy system planning and policy. So I'll start out with the conceptualization of the energy system modeling done as part of the Net Zero America project. Then I'll provide some motivation regarding other types of objectives that we can incorporate into energy systems planning other than costs. Then I'll discuss two case studies. The first looks at coal power plant retirements in the United States, and the second focuses on the shale gas boom and bust in the Appalachian Basin. So I'm going to make the assumption that everyone here has seen some variant of the Net Zero America talk at least once, if not several times. And so I just want to give a brief overview of that work and the conceptual model that we used for that project. So in that project, we used a macro energy systems optimization model, which selects the least cost set of technologies over time to achieve a net zero emissions goal. Then we used output from that macro energy systems optimization model and fed it into different spatial planning models to select the location of technologies based on least cost or other simple siting heuristics. And then taking the downscaled spatial modeling results, we then modeled impacts in terms of land use impacts, employment impacts, and air quality impacts. So the impacts were a function of decisions related to technology and planning decisions. So now I'll walk briefly through each of these modules and what exactly we're doing for each of these to try to motivate the modeling process, and then how we can reorient this modeling process to better incorporate non-cost objectives. So beginning with the macro energy systems optimization model. So this figure shows electric power capacity over time in a reference case versus 4 different pathways that each achieve a net zero emissions target by mid-century. So for example, you can see alternative futures for gas across the different pathways, which is indicated in gray. There are also a lot of assumptions that go into modeling modeling these futures. Structurally, at a high level, we're selecting least cost pathways to achieve our emission target over time. So in other words, we're optimizing for total system cost over the life of the transition, given perfect information about perfect technology cost and learning curves. We're assuming perfect foresight in the capacity to seamlessly integrate energy supplies and demands across sectors. And we're also assuming rational and efficient markets in response to which investors are able to mobilize capital instantly. In reality, transitions are much more complex than that. So as a modeler, one should be very acquainted with the limitations of distilling this complexity. And it also requires a large dose of humility to acknowledge what we can say using these models and what we really don't know. And these models here are not meant to be predictive. So in my opinion, the purpose of these macro energy systems models in this context is to clarify the contours of what could be, what we need to plan for, what the consequences of our choices are, what the trade-offs are, and how do we reduce different types of transition risks. So the core of my main research acknowledges the utility of these macro energy systems models to provide insight, but also the frailty of many models to address the many social, environmental, and political objectives and constraints that may drive policy and planning processes. So this is moving on to the second module, right? So the first one is macro energy systems modeling, and the outputs of that then feed into different spatial planning and siting decisions, which are again based on least cost principles or simple heuristics given a pre-selected subset of technologies. So this is an example of some results from the Net Zero America project, right? So this is a snapshot in 2020 of utility scale solar, which is indicated in the gold color, wind, which is in blue, and then transmission infrastructure, which is in gray. And so this is a snapshot in 2020. And this is a snapshot in 2050 in one instantiation of the future, right? So in the case of wind, for example, there are many impacts on the physical landscapes and ecosystems, and there may be local opposition because of fossil fuel incumbency, potential for visual impacts and mistrust in institutions, all which may influence the siting of this different types of infrastructure. So I went over kind of generally the macro energy systems modeling, give you an example of the spatial planning modeling. And then the third, we estimate impacts based on those 2 previous modules, right? So impacts in terms of air quality impacts. Here's an example of employment impacts. We look at wage impacts and workforce development in addition to land use impacts. And so we treat these different socioeconomic environmental impacts as outcomes of decisions that we make regarding technology selection and siting. There's a lot of things that are going to influence these different economic and environmental impacts. So it's not just resource quality and availability that's going to dictate these features and different features of the technologies. So technology selection or the rate of electrification. There's also choice regarding domestic manufacturing. Again, something like that, we can decide where we build out, and to the extent that we build out domestic manufacturing of things like solar and wind products, which will then influence local and state level economic impacts. Other modifiable socio-technical factors that will influence these outcomes are things like different types of siting constraints and different types of political and policy process and constraints. So what I'm showing here is just one instantiation of the future of potential job impacts based on a set of assumptions. So the question becomes, does this process reflect the way transition planning decisions will or should be made, right? So transitioning to a net zero energy system is inherently a multi-objective planning process, right? So decisions will not be or do not need to be solely driven based on economic factors or technology factors. Rather, there's interactions between different types of objectives, like labor objectives, politics, social equity, land use objectives, and different air quality related objectives as well. So I'm going to walk through a couple of other categories that I mentioned here to give you a flavor for what I mean by kind of incorporating things like politics and social equity in the way we think about these transitions. So here I'm showing kind of a snapshot of existing fossil fuel electricity infrastructure. And each point represents a different facility. And you can see the colors indicate the voting classification based on the 2016 presidential election and indicating if the facility is sited in an area that is either Republican or Democrat supermajority or majority district or a moderate district. And so as you can see, a majority of our fossil fuel electricity infrastructure is within either Republican supermajority or majority district. So coal, you see almost all of that, all coal electric power capacity is located within Republican districts, same with natural gas. And in addition, most of our wind resources are located within Republican supermajority districts. You see similar patterns with kind of transmission and multiple types of industrial facilities as well, and other types of supporting infrastructure like natural gas pipelines, majority of which is located in Republican districts. This figure shows that kind of most greenhouse gas emission sources are also in Republican majority or supermajority counties. So this is kind of aggregates across all types of energy and industrial facilities and the emissions, a snapshot of emissions in 2018, and then overlaying it with voting patterns. So if you look at kind of 2016 presidential election results, about 70% of emissions are within Republican majority or supermajority districts. You see an increasing, at the industry level, increasing polarization in areas where you have a lot of industrial infrastructure as well. So that was just kind of give you some sense of how politics could start to interact with our siting decisions, as revealed through where current infrastructure is sited. Another thing that I wanted to touch on is inequities that are embedded within our infrastructure system. So I've done kind of various different analyses that kind of demonstrate empirically that how inequities are embedded in our existing carbon producing and industrial infrastructure using different types of regression and other empirically based results to show that there's systemic inequities and there's site level inequities across different dimensions of equity related to things like income and race and other types of demographic and socioeconomic variables. And so kind of to give you an example to bring this closer to home, this is a look at all known contaminated sites, most of which are types of industrial facilities in New Jersey. So each point represents a contaminated site. And this is identifies the overburdened communities based on the percentage of the population that is minority, low income, or both, based on a recent environmental justice law passed in New Jersey. And so you can see there's a direct overlay between kind of known contaminated sites in New Jersey and what's considered overburdened communities based on these different income and race classifications, right? And so this pattern is something kind of, if you're someone operating in the field in New Jersey, you see that without having to understand that inherently, without having to look at a map or do any type of empirical analysis. But the empirical analysis, we can show that as well here. And then you can see these similar patterns across all types of industrial and energy system infrastructure across the US. Another thing I want to mention is that multiple emission sources are often concentrated in vulnerable communities. So this is kind of at the county level, shows CO2, a snapshot of CO2 emissions in 2018 for each county, with kind of your redder colors where you have a concentration of emissions. And this just points out a couple of areas within the US where you have kind of vulnerable populations, like more than half or almost half of the population is either low income or non-white. And then you see multiple sources of emissions. So multiple large types of facilities. So for example, in Indiana, you have a large, in Lake County, Indiana, you have a large steel industry, but then you also have a lot of other types of infrastructure as well. Same thing if you look at East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana, many types of an industrial and energy system infrastructure. And so this also then suggests too that when we're transitioning our energy system, a lot of these types of facilities are going to have to transition in some way. So we have to start incorporating these different types of social equity objectives related to both benefits and costs that may be derived by these communities in our systems modeling and planning. This kind of rolls up the interaction between greenhouse gas emissions from industrial energy systems and infrastructure and the intersection with vulnerable communities. This here just looking at low income communities and communities with a high non-white population. So about 12% of our greenhouse gas emissions are within low income communities, and about 8% of emissions, the source is communities with a high non-white population. And so this is just kind of a very loose indicator of these intersections, but of course, it's much more nuanced than this. So now I want to go into kind of two actual examples of how you begin to incorporate all of these non-cost objectives and constraints into systems modeling. So I'll begin with a case study that looks at coal-fired power plant retirements. It's a fairly stylized context, in part to try to motivate how we start to incorporate non-cost objectives. So in the beginning, I showed kind of the process we used a traditional process used in modeling systems. You have your energy systems, optimization modeling, spatial downscaling, and then you model impacts, which are a result of decisions, techno-economic decisions. In this study, I'm showing you kind of integrate the last two steps where you still do the macro energy systems optimization model, but then you actually incorporate impact objectives into the modeling and planning and downscaling process. So I'll begin by providing a baseline of the air pollution related impacts from coal power plants associated with fine particulate matter. So this is in 2018, there were about 11,000 premature mortalities or deaths associated with emissions from 390 coal-fired power plants. And so this equates to about $100 billion in air pollution damages. So this represents impacts in a single year. And so this figure shows mortality for each county on a log scale and the location of each power plant. And you can see the transport of impacts and elevated impacts outside the vicinity of these power plants as well. So I also estimate the baseline inequities to better understand what dimensions of equity are most relevant in this context and in modeling and designing future policies and plans regarding coal power plant retirements. So a way to measure the distribution of air pollution impacts across different subpopulation is through the comparison of mortality rates associated with emissions from coal power plants. So this shows that mortality rate in terms of deaths per 100,000 people by income bracket. And so you can see that air pollution impacts are regressive, such that the highest mortality rates are for the lowest income subpopulation, and the lowest mortality rates are for the highest income subpopulation. And so this regressive trend is something that I've also found to be consistent across many industrial and energy sectors within the US. So I also look at many other different attributes. So for example, for poverty, there's not really a substantial difference between mortality rates between those above and below the poverty line. With respect to race, you can see a higher mortality rate for Black or African Americans. Again, this is a consistent finding that you see across many industries as well. We also see that there's the highest mortality rates in rural areas, which is not really surprising given that our coal power plants tend to be sited away from populations. And I also do an overlay of voting patterns, which is not quite a dimension of equity. And so this is based on the 2016 county level presidential election voting patterns. And we show there's a higher mortality rate in Republican leading communities. And then I also compare mortality rates for counties based on national ambient air quality standards. And so there's a lower mortality rate in NAAQS non-attainment counties associated with coal electric power generation. So kind of that gives you an indicator of the types of things that we may want to consider in trying to model future systems. How do we upend some of the existing inequities within this system? So what we want to understand are really the future air pollution impacts and inequities related to coal electric power. So going back to the figure that I showed in the beginning of future pathways to achieve net zero emissions, you can see that coal capacity, which is in red, declines by about 60% by 2030 in the reference scenario, and across the net zero scenarios, coal is completely eliminated by 2030. And so to model the future system, I developed a simple optimization to sequence the retirement of 730 coal generators. So I initially modeled the retirement of coal generators based on a climate objective, which is specified as a constraint in this problem, and then modeled the closure of facilities, assuming that power plants will retire based on operating costs. So those generators with higher operating costs, which are a function of things like the vintage of a facility, emissions abatement, and capacity, will retire first. So this is somewhat consistent with what has been empirically observed, although what has historically driven these retirements may not align with how future retirements will manifest, especially under different climate policies. So here I want to show a simulation of air pollution impacts and facility retirements from 2020 to 2050 in the reference case scenario, so without a climate policy, and a net zero scenario with a binding emissions constraint. So what you can see is a much more rapid decline in coal power plants by 2030 in the net zero scenario, and elimination of associated air pollution related impacts. And in the reference scenario, air pollution impacts decline over time, but there are still persistent impacts. So this in part demonstrates how our kind of long-lived infrastructure can have persistent and compounding effects for communities. So from 2020 to 2050, over 100,000 premature deaths are avoided by retiring coal electric power plants earlier and in line with the net zero goal. And so this equates to a monetized benefit of about $1 trillion of avoided damages. So this is retirement based on kind of differential cost objectives. So now I'll move on to a scenario in which cumulative impacts and equity objectives are incorporated into the energy system modeling of coal retirements. So as I kind of described before, these energy systems models are often based on cost objectives such as minimizing costs or maximizing profits. And a large focus of my research is on incorporating these other non-cost objectives so that they are directly incorporated into our decision-making processes rather than treating equity and cumulative impacts as ancillary to the analysis. So we can add objectives related to air pollution. For example, we can minimize cumulative air quality impacts or deaths, or we can minimize air pollution impacts on certain subpopulations or communities. So we're essentially making decisions on the retirements based on other non-cost objectives. So here I'm going to compare the cumulative mortality associated with different types of both costs and non-cost objectives. So all of these are assuming that net zero emissions are achieved. So essentially, we're just choosing the retirement pathway to achieve our net zero emissions goal. So a retirement schedule based on minimizing costs results in about 40,000 premature mortalities over time. And if we change the objective and retirements are dictated by trying to minimize cumulative mortality, cumulative mortality is reduced to about 25,000 deaths. So this suggests that more benefits could be derived through a targeted air pollution related policy beyond a climate policy. We then look at different objectives that instill different normative ethical principles. So what if we try to minimize air pollution impacts on low income subpopulations? So everyone that is low income across the US, and we show that it's very similar to the outcome as trying to minimize cumulative mortalities across the US. We then operationalize in terms of just minimizing impacts in low-income communities. So here defined based on a subset of counties in which a large share of the population is low income. So all the counties that are outlined in black in this map. So you can see that there is a trade-off in how you operationalize the equity objective influences the cumulative and distributional outcome. I then defined objectives that don't look at the aggregate impact, but rather the relative impact. So minimize the difference in mortality rates between low income and average or low income and high income population. So this results in higher cumulative effects and higher impacts for low income subpopulations and communities. And similarly, I define objectives for different equity and political dimensions. So here, essentially, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that we can operationalize some forms of equity based on different ethical principles, and we can design standards and inform where we should be making investments based on this sort of approach. But also ultimately, there needs to be some clarification of kind of a collective ethical preferences or social contract or societal preferences. Otherwise, societal preferences will be implied by the decisions that we make over time. So now I'll move into kind of the second case study, which was the focus of part of my doctoral research, which focuses on cumulative air, climate, and employment impacts and equity objectives of the shale gas boom in the Appalachian Basin, right? So it's incorporating not just air pollution, different dimensions of air pollution related impacts, but it also intersects with climate objectives and labor market objectives as well. So in these sets of studies, I focus on three impacts: employment, air quality, and climate change, because they each have different spatial and temporal attributes and accumulating attributes. So I also considered these impacts because they're often the subject of public concern and political discourse in the region, but by no means are these impact areas meant to be comprehensive. So this is a historical snapshot. So there's our trade-offs that are often not accounted for our energy system planning models. So looking at these three impact areas together, I show that employment impacts over time, which is indicated in red in the figure on the left, air quality impacts in orange, and climate impacts in blue. So air quality and employment impacts follow the boom and bust cycle within the region, whereas climate impacts peak and persist well beyond the short run boom and bust cycle of the natural gas development. The figure on the right shows the spatial distribution of cumulative impacts from 2004 to 2016, and this just shows the overlay of air pollution related deaths and job years created from natural gas development. So everywhere in blue, more job years created at the county level. There's more jobs created than life years lost. Anywhere in the warmer colors, more like air pollution related life years are lost than job years are created from activity across the natural gas supply chain within the region. So that gives kind of a historical framing of what the different types of cumulative impacts are. We also did a study looking at different dimensions of equity, which I won't go over here, but it gives some motivation for what types of objectives we can start to incorporate into our systems modeling. So I developed what's called the multi-objective energy and equity model while I was a PhD student, which is a macro energy systems model that incorporates air quality, climate, and employment activities and helps make decisions regarding activity and infrastructure across supply chains. So far, I've built this out for most types of thermal facilities and industrial facilities. So in kind of there's a couple ways to kind of incorporate multiple objectives that are kind of natively in different physical units. One, we can monetize everything, right? So we can look at employment as a benefit. So cumulative monetized employment minus monetized air pollution damages and climate damages. So in this context, we're seeking optimality. So the feasible solution that yields the best value of the objective function. So in a very kind of traditional optimization framing. But we can also keep our objectives in kind of native physical units and use what's called multi-objective optimization, right? So we can try to maximize job years or the fair distribution of jobs over time and within space. We can also kind of minimize air pollution related deaths or the other types of objectives that I specified in the previous case study. And then in this variant of the model, we're also not treating climate impacts or as some type of emissions cap. Rather, you're trying to minimize climate related impacts in terms of global mean temperature effects. So in this type of multi-objective optimization modeling, what we're seeking is non-inferiority. So no other feasible solution that will yield an improvement in one of our objectives without degradation in at least one other objective. So I'm going to show a very kind of simple example of applying this type of method in terms of natural gas development in the Appalachian Basin, but looking historically. So how could we have better built out our natural gas system had we been incorporating these other non-cost objectives initially? So this shows the trade-off between employment impacts in terms of 1,000 job years and air quality impacts in terms of premature mortality. So the point on the figure now shows actual impacts from cumulative impacts from 2004 to 2016. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty around those estimates, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just gonna kind of leave uncertainty aside. So again, that's actual impacts. If we have a monetized objective, you can improve on both the employment objective in terms of trying to maximize employment benefits and also improve on the air quality objective, trying to minimize air pollution related deaths. If we're looking at our multi-objective function, in this case, focusing on the trade-off between air employment and air pollution related effects, everything along what the Pareto frontier is the non-inferior set. So you can't improve one objective without degrading the other. And so there's not kind of a singular objective, but rather where along the Pareto frontier may be dictated by different preferences regarding trade-offs between air pollution related impacts and employment impacts. And so underlying this are within the model, there's a lot of different decisions that you can be making regarding where you site infrastructure, different types of standards that you can set as well. So there's kind of underlying this are different policies that could drive you to the Pareto frontier. So improving both air quality and employment outcomes. And so that was just kind of a simplified example of how you can start to think about incorporating multiple objectives into the energy system planning processes. And so in the macro energy system space, integrating multiple non-cost objectives is considered the frontier of research in this space. I would like to point out, though, that this type of modeling framework has been used for decades, and in some respect is kind of coming around again given the decision context that we're facing, but also our computational abilities to model out these different types of objectives as well. And kind of with that, kind of the whole kind of purpose of this is trying to build a better modeling framework that embodies our multiple objectives and translates and distills our relevant social, environmental, political, and technical and economic information for multiple stakeholders. So it's a combined multi-objective energy systems planning optimization that selects technologies and locations over time to achieve net zero emissions based on multiple objectives. And with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you very much, Erin. So the floor is open for questions. Feel free to either raise your hand electronically or put them in the Q&A box. Charlie's got his hand up.
Dude. Thank you, Erin. That was great. I had well, I'll keep it to one question in case other folks want to chime in. But you showed some results sort of in the middle there, and you were optimizing for minimizing to minimize cumulative mortality, and then you showed kind of an overall cumulative mortality, and then there was a distribution of it across different groups. And I was curious if that was the distribution, were those individual targeted outcomes, or was that just the result of minimizing the cumulative? So, you know, you had a bigger impact on lower income communities. And so my question is, in each of those distributional outcomes, were those individual scenarios, or are those just the results fleshed out across the overall cumulative mortality reduction?
So each of those were based on different objectives, but it's the same outcome. So it's all looking at cumulative mortalities across the population. So for example, we might be minimizing air pollution related impacts on low income populations, but the result is kind of the cumulative mortality across the population, right? So how do, thinking about it kind of more broadly or more generally, if we implement a certain type of equity objective into our policy design, how does that influence cumulative impacts, right? And I mean, I was just showing cumulative impacts as one form of outcome. We also looked at kind of distributional effects as well. So each of those objectives is related to different distributional effects as well.
I guess then the other question I'll follow up with is when you're optimizing, let's say for cumulative or different objectives, how different is the cost outcome for each of those scenarios? So for someone who says, if I'm going to do these multi-objective minimization problems, how much is it going to cost me? Do they come out really similar? Or are they constrained to be similar? That's the question.
Yeah. So there are kind of some observable bold trade-offs within the coal sequencing study, but the decision context kind of is very simple. We're just retiring, right? So there's the costs that we're considering are on the scale of these transitions is kind of simple. For the natural gas study, I didn't expressly model costs. I modeled decisions if they were driven by these other objectives. I would say that when I started that modeling process, my intention was to include kind of traditional cost objectives, but that does not kind of, how I specified them did not follow how things actually played out. either, right? So they weren't indicative of how things historically played out. So kind of empirically, the drivers of the shale gas boom were multifaceted, and so it's not this trying to minimize system cost or even maximizing kind of profits. There's probably some other factors in there that were driving development, and you have like concentrated beneficiaries, which kind of might have driven those things. But I couldn't. What I'm saying is I couldn't even have modeled a robust cost objective that would have mimicked historical production.
Gotcha. Because of the number of different factors affecting that.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Looks like we have Mitch Small has a question. Mitch, do you want to unmute or somebody will unmute you and ask your question?
I think I'm unmuted.
We can hear you.
Hi, Eric. How are you?
Good.
Good. Hi, Erin. Wonderful talk. Wonderful work. Something came to mind when I was looking at some of your results that have a more spatial detail than I'm used to seeing. Not that it isn't there in reality, but usually it's hard to capture it. Everything from the Republican versus the Democratic states, and the particular maps on transmission and where the wind's going to be sited and everything like that. And so the question that I have is there any possibility to analyze, maybe in your future studies, spatially disaggregated decision-making? I mean, I don't know if it's legal. I mean, we usually make these kind of decisions at a national level, but is there room to allow local values, which differ from location to location, to come into play? The one application where this would be possibly most relevant is shale gas, where different communities may view the benefits and the risk differently. So are we going to have anybody look at localized decision-making on climate mitigation?
So the tools that were built out and kind of since refined in the Net Zero America project and are continuing to be refined, the idea is that they can be used in different kind of regional contexts, given different sets of objectives. Even if you have preference information, you could incorporate it in that. And I mean, even kind of the modeling that I did as part of my thesis was to do kind of more spatially downscaled modeling, given like asset level specificity, kind of downscaling the air pollution effects and reducing the form of those models so that you can integrate it into an optimization that could be driven by different community objectives, same with labor. So the idea is to, we have a couple projects now to kind of refine some of these tools and build out these tools more so they can be used in different contexts, and they are being used in different contexts.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Mitch. There's a question that came in through the chat that's similar to one I was going to ask. Let me read the chat first. And how do we get this messaging to the community so the citizens would push for more equitable energy decisions and responsible energy transition? For example, I love the jobs impact and the health impact. Would love to bring this to our communities we work in as a rep for Siemens. This is from Robert Boya Jeff. And sort of expanding on that, the question I have is, you know, what is the role for academics and this kind of modeling in actually informing policy decisions? And also, what is the role for academics in engaging with stakeholders to try to accelerate the transition, sort of along the lines that Robert is talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the thing that each academic will define for themselves. My orientation here is that, you know, we are developing these models to facilitate decision making, right? And so I think there needs to be the model of doing this. One model of doing that was a Net Zero America project, right? So where we had different types of stakeholder engagement. for kind of the shale gas work that was while building out the model. It's talking to a lot of different stakeholders in informal ways to understand what objectives might be kind of salient or useful, to understand the different modifiable factors in terms of policy and planning decisions that we incorporate in these models. So inherently, there has to be kind of throughout the modeling process, in my opinion, there should be some level of interaction with stakeholders. Some of it can be more formalized. When you start to think about kind of incorporating preferences, that's kind of like a whole nother layer of interaction through different kind of survey instruments or different types of deliberative democracy forums and those sorts of things, where kind of we can communicate different kind of options and trade-offs, but then kind of more so be listening to different constituencies to understand their preferences. And so it's kind of this feedback loop. So I think that's kind of important to me to engage with communities throughout the modeling process and after the modeling process as well. I think each project is different, so how that engagement will occur has to be different across the different contexts as well. So I mean, in every modeling study, we're not going to be kind of in the community at all steps, right? There's a lot of just inherently modeling that we have to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, Melanie Cudney has a question. Impressive work, Erin. She says, do you anticipate these non-cost objectives to start to be required to be modeled in utility integrated resource plans when comparing various investments? And how do you see these objectives moving forward from a policy perspective?
Okay, so maybe I'll talk not so much in terms of integrated research planning, but maybe if you're thinking more about federal policy and planning and those policy processes, right? Even if you look at kind of the Biden administration, part of their plans is, or their policy agendas are trying to ensure that 40% of benefits flow to vulnerable communities, right? So that means we have to, if we're want to use these macro energy system models to inform policy going forward, I mean, they're increasingly used in these contexts, then we have to start incorporating non-cost objectives inherently, right? So how do we ensure that 40% of benefits, and how do we define those benefits flow to vulnerable communities, and defining what vulnerable communities are. So I think from a policy agenda setting perspective, incorporating those objectives, these other types of objectives, or whether they're constraints into the modeling process is important. And then later on in kind of the policy process, I think there's going to be kind of even more need to develop and employ analytical approaches that are directly addressing environmental justice and different dimensions of social equity beyond what has historically been done as doing like an environmental justice analysis as an ancillary analysis to a cost benefit analysis to make decisions regarding kind of policies. So I think kind of moving forward, this is kind of not just kind of, we have to further develop these models, and I think there's a lot of utility in policy planning processes.
Okay, another question from Sambuddha Chakrabarti. This might be very basic, he says, but it's curious. He observes that both for the fossil fuel electricity production and renewables, it seems like there's a high share of Republican voting districts from the slide you showed. Any assignable cause and explanation for that?
I mean, part of it, just like spatially, you have more areas that kind of in space that are Republican areas. That doesn't align with kind of the voting population though. So in part it's because just kind of spatially there's more Republican areas, tend to be more rural, and you tend to cite things to the extent that you can, or that's historically how those processes for at least some industries have worked. That's another reason. In a place like Texas, you have different permitting regimes too, right? So a lot of that wind build out in Republican supermajority districts is within Texas, and they have permissive permitting policies. So that you see that effect too. Yeah, there's a lot of different interactions, and so that's kind of also leads to sentiments regarding kind of climate policy through different survey methods don't actually necessarily align with where things are actually built out, right? There's a disconnect between kind of stated preference and our revealed preferences.
Interesting. So I have another question. So what do you see as sort of the biggest challenges to doing this kind of multi-objective modeling? Is it computational capacity? Is it data? Is it getting a handle on uncertainties? Sort of what are the biggest issues that you see?
I think it's all of those things. I think the data burden is very high, and we have to reduce the complexity of a lot of the modeling that we're doing, and we're inherently modeling uncertain future systems. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Just kind of, if you think about air pollution, for example, there's uncertainty kind of in air chemistry going forward. We have a lot of different options with respect to how we build out our infrastructure, which will create uncertainty or some type of heterogeneity. You have shifting populations, this shifting exposure over time. So you have these compounding uncertainties when you start to incorporate these other objectives, and you're working at finer spatial resolution. So there's even kind of more uncertainty around that. And yeah, the data burden and the modeling burden is just like order of magnitudes more than kind of traditional macro energy systems models. Yeah.
So it sounds like an academic career is ahead of you to deal with all of these issues. So let me get slightly political. So Joe Biden has now set the U.S. up to get to 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. So first part of the question, is that achievable? Second part of the question, is that achievable with environmental justice and equity?
Mm-hmm. So I'll bypass kind of both of the questions in a way. So, right, so our modeling isn't predictive, and a lot of it is will be shaped by public investment, and so that kind of will be seen, although I'm optimistic generally kind of, and with respect to environmental justice, I think there's kind of this narrative, or more broadly kind of social equity, and the trade-offs between social equity and meeting our climate goals, and I don't see that as kind of a generalizable inherent trade-off. Social equity is multidimensional. It's not a singular concept. So of course, I think this is an opportunity to upend a lot of the existing embedded inequities in our infrastructure. I mean, I also think that like new inequities will arise, and that's why kind of modeling or having different kind of stopgaps in how we build out these systems to understand the distributional effects, we can inherently incorporate that. And there's, in a generalizable sense, kind of, I don't think it's right for me to think that environmental justice or social equity is generalizably in conflict with our climate objectives.
Well dodged. So there is this modeling is really time data intensive, and is it possible to derive sort of generalized lessons from, you spent 3 or 4 years on your Appalachia work, I think, or more. Can we generalize that to be able to speed up the process for other communities, other regions, and translate into actions without having to go through all of the detailed work that you've done?
Well, I think hopefully kind of we built out the tools to the extent that they're easily accessible to different communities, so that a lot of the burden is building out the initial models themselves, like time burden wise, right? And so that they can quickly be used in those other types of contexts. With respect to kind of broader lessons learned, I mean, there were lessons learned from the work in Appalachian Basin, which is still ongoing, right? It's going to extend for a much longer time. But every context is kind of specific. So there's some things, lessons learned, but a lot of things are context specific. And so those have to be addressed inherently in different transitions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But hopefully these types of modeling tools, though, kind of help kind of move kind of some of the planning processes forward, right? So you don't have the initial burden of figuring out like the suite of options, right? We have quicker ways to come to what those are.
Right. Is one of your objectives in your work to make basically public accessible models that can be used, open source?
Yeah, that is part of it. I think in a lot of these spaces, there's just fundamental model development. And so I think it just has to go through more levels of review to mature to the point that it can be open source, right? So doing an open source kind of power systems model is a different ballgame than these multi-objective models, which have to go. There are a lot of the inherent objectives and data and formulations are just new, so those just need to mature enough so they can be eventually open sourced.
Mm-hmm. Charlie, you have your hand up again.
I do. I'm actually asking a question that came through the Q&A that I'm going to try to translate because the details were a little vague. The questioner asked, why not focus on solar energy, and then added a comment about impacts the environment. But I guess to try to translate that, my question would be, you have multiple components of the energy, the macro energy systems, the natural gas plants, coal plant retirements, implementation of solar and wind. For, I guess, to what extent and how much of each of those individual pieces have you done the modeling, incorporating multi-objective analyses, and which ones do you think are the kind of key ones to focus on? The expanding of renewables, or the retirement of the fossil fuels. I mean, it's clear the air quality impacts, and some of the things that would be improvements in environmental quality would be, I think, more associated with coal plant retirements. But let's say you have potentially other objectives you could include with expansion of renewables. So I'll leave it there and I'll mute myself and listen to the answer.
Yes, so that's part of the plan and kind of work that we're doing as part of kind of the repeat project in Jesse Jenkins' lab, trying to kind of refine some of the modeling done in Net Zero America. So that incorporates renewables and transmission. And so the objectives start to look different. There's different types of land use objectives, which have been kind of modeled, and kind of historically this multi-objective modeling approach has been used in many forms based on land use objectives. So that becomes important. There's other types of benefits and thinking about the distribution of those effects as well when renewables and transmission come into the equation. I would also mention kind of in different types of industrial facilities. So there's a lot more decisions related to that, like how we convert those facilities, whether we could do brownfield redevelopment and greenfield development. And so it's kind of beyond kind of air pollution and employment effects. There's all types of legacy impacts from those types of infrastructure, and how you kind of integrate that into these systems models and drive decisions regarding kind of siting as well.
Okay, I think we're out of time here. I'll just close by saying thank you very much, Erin, for that. That was a great talk and interesting discussion. And really best of luck at Dartmouth. We look forward to seeing great things from you in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Yes, thank you again, Erin, for that excellent talk and for your thought-provoking research. Also want to thank the Andlinger Center staff who are working hard behind the scenes to support the creation and delivery of this seminar series. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today. Next week's webinar will be at 11 a.m. on Thursday, July 8th. That's 11 Eastern time, when Dr. Yanan Chen will discuss his research to develop novel power electronics for efficient energy distribution in multi-port conversion systems, like those found in solar power generation, battery management systems, and computer servers. You can find a link to the speaker series webpage and registration links in the chat box. And we look forward to seeing you at future talks. In the meantime, stay safe and healthy and have a good week.